Okay, I'm going to go ahead. We've got about 30 people in. I'll go ahead and open. So welcome to New Perspectives, all. As most of you know, New Perspectives is an integral yoga platform that's sponsored by Aro University in Surat, India, as well as Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat and here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. And all three organizations are founded by H.P. Rama. I'm Rade, the Executive Director of Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn, and I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, who is our moderator for today's webinar. And we are also joined by Dr. Kiran Singh, who is Dean of Humanities at our university, as well as the Director of Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat. So before beginning our webinar, let us take a few moments of silence. As we continue our journey on the evolution of consciousness, we are extremely honored to welcome back by popular demand Dr. Brant Cortright. Dr. Cortright spoke on New Perspectives several weeks ago regarding the psychic being and its evolution and role in integral yoga. And today he addresses how the growth of our psychic being is reflected in the ongoing growth of our surface nature, including the brain. In his book, The Neurogenesis, Diet and Lifestyle, Dr. Cortright states that to realize our greatest potential, our brain must operate at its highest level. The key to tapping into this potential is neurogenesis, the process of creating new neurons or brain cells. So in this New Perspectives webinar today, Dr. Cortright will explain the process of neurogenesis and how the brain renews and upgrades itself. As he stresses, by restoring the brain's natural health and growth, our sadhana can proceed more rapidly. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, who will be our moderator for today and open the New Perspective Forum. Vladimir?
Thank you, Radha. Yes, we are very happy to have with us again Dr. Brant Cortright, who is a professor emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies and is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in San Francisco, focused on brain health, anxiety, and depression. He is the author of Integral Psychology, Yoga Growth and Opening the Heart, and other books such as Psychotherapy and Spirit, and the most recent book, which is the Amazon's #1 bestseller, Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. So today's topic is As Above, So Below, the evolution of consciousness meets neuroscience and brain health. As we know, Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga aims to accelerate the evolution of consciousness by an integral development of our whole being, body, heart, mind, spirit. The development of our surface being, of our container, as it were, of our body, heart, and mind, is a part of sadhana. So we can be the most skilled instruments of the innermost consciousness in us, capable of the greatest contribution to the deeper unfolding. So the ongoing growth of our psychic being is reflected in the ongoing growth of our surface being, or ego, as well as our brain. When this growth slows down, we get symptoms such as anxiety, depression, brain fog, or cognitive decline, which create interference with our deeper inner guidance. Given the neurotoxic minefield of daily life, no one escapes this neurogenic slowing. This presentation aims to restore the brain's natural health and growth so that our sadhana can proceed as rapidly as possible. With this brief introduction, I welcome Dr. Brant Cortright to address the audience. Please, Brant.
Thank you. It's good to be here in this integral yoga community. So my work has really been over the past few decades trying to, first of all, understand and wrap my mind around Sri Aurobindo's writings, which wisdom to contemporary knowledge. And so the integral yoga or the integral psychology book that I did some years ago was really an attempt to relate integral yoga to contemporary psychology. And as I mentioned last time, to situate contemporary psychology within the context, the larger context of integral yoga. And since then, I've gone on to really look at neuroscience and explore how the functioning of our brain relates to sadhana as well. So let's start with this integral vision, right? Sri Aurobindo, as far as I know, he has explored inner consciousness more completely, at greater depth, greater height than any other spiritual teacher that I'm aware of anyway, and given us this extraordinary vision of integral consciousness and of the evolution of consciousness, right? That he really took Darwin's evolutionary theory and he applied it to consciousness, right? That the divine, first of all, involves itself to create this whole universe, the Big Bang, 14 billion years ago. Then after billions of years, out of that emerges life. 4 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago, we get unicellular organisms. We get life, the vital principle. Then after another couple billion years, we get the first developments of mind in animals. But in animals, as Sri Aurobindo reminds us, mind is imprisoned by the senses. It's not until the human level comes that mind comes into its own, where mind can stand back from the senses, reflect on what's going on. So what Sri Aurobindo did was he said that the evolutionary theory that Darwin and biology talks about is really the most outer tip of the iceberg, and that the real story of evolution is the evolution of consciousness. That the evolution of species and bodies is necessary to house this growing consciousness. We need more and more capacity to express and develop this growing consciousness. And in human beings, this reaches an apex. Not at least so far. Like we're still evolving. We're not done yet. And the principle that evolves in us is the psychic being, right? We have these two dimensions to our spiritual nature. We have the Atman, this impersonal, non-evolving dimension of consciousness, one with Brahman, that presides over everything equally. And then in the evolution, participating in the evolution, we have the psychic being, which develops lifetime after lifetime. There's an inner growth of consciousness around this psychic being. as the psychic being develops, in flowers and in plants, there's a psychic presence. In animals, there's a greater sense of that presence, developing even more. And in human beings, it becomes a fully formed being. But the first X number of incarnations are really focused on developing the instrument, the body, heart, and mind, the instrumental nature. After a certain amount of evolution has happened, and the psychic being has grown stronger, more mature, more individuated, it begins to exert more and more of an influence on the outer being. And as that happens, it begins to turn us first towards what Plato called the good, the true, and the beautiful. That begins to attract us rather than just lost in the senses, lost in outwardness, which so much of the world is. It begins to turn us towards higher values. And then at a certain point, it begins to turn us towards the divine itself, away from these figures of the divine towards the divine itself. And so as this happens, evolution becomes more and more conscious, right? That it starts off unconscious. And when it's unconscious, it's slow and meandering. But as evolution becomes conscious, it accelerates. It moves forward more directly. So that with spiritual practice, with sadhana, which is accelerated evolution, essentially, we get progress in one lifetime that would have taken many lifetimes, or progress within a few years that would have taken much, much longer. So in this evolution of consciousness, not only is the inner soul or psychic being developing, but we are also developing our outer being too, our body, heart, and mind, our instrumental nature, right? For Sri Aurobindo and the mother, integral yoga was a many-sided development of our being. We want to develop the physical, right? So at the ashram, there's gymnastics, there's yoga, there's the development of the physical. There's the development of the emotional realm as well. There's the development of the mind. We need to develop our instrumental nature as fully as possible, again, in order to be instruments of the divine, more and more perfect instruments of the divine. And so Sri Aurobindo was, I think, one of the first to really relate personal growth to spiritual growth, that these two are really intertwined, and that the spiritual growth needs to be guiding the personal growth, right? Personal growth can easily take over and just move in its own sphere. But when the psychic is guiding it, when the soul's guidance is foremost, then the development of our outer being proceeds in a way that is really unique to us. So the psychic being is this constant progress, as the mother has said. It's continually progressing. And there is this progression inwardly over lifetimes, but also within this lifetime, right? There is, first of all, this unconscious influence of the soul, then it becomes more and more conscious. It communicates by a sense of unease when we're moving in the wrong direction, by a kind of essential spiritual feeling it communicates, not so much by thought as by feeling. So it seems like in psychology, Western psychology, what it studies is the growth of the outer being, this surface body, heart, mind, self, or ego. And what psychology has discovered is that when the growth of this outer being is blocked, we get symptoms. We get anxiety, we get depression, we get all the myriad types of pain, emotional pain that we see around us. And this happens because we are wounded early on right? Everybody in this planet gets wounded. There are traumas, big T traumas, little t traumas. There are ways in which the parents are unable to fully be there. And so the child develops this ego structure in which the wounds and the hurts get covered over, get defended against. And this creates a certain lack of coherence in the surface self. The authentic self gets, some of that has to get pushed down, and a kind of false self has to develop. So ourselves, our actual egos and selves, are this kind of mixture of some authentic self, but also many defensive structures as well. These defensive structures serve to protect the person in their relationship with their parents, right? Because the parents, because of their wounding and their parents' wounding going back forever, certain parts of the self are off limits. They're threatening to the parents. And so they become threatening to the self. And so we develop these inner splits inside. And psychology attempts to heal those. And as those inner splits get healed, as those early wounds get healed, and the defensive structures fall away and are replaced with more and more authentic self, more and more svabhava, as Sri Aurobindo would say, more and more of our kind of essential nature in this lifetime, there comes about a more and more, a greater coherence, a greater integration, right? The surface self, instead of being split off, becomes more and more whole, more and more complete. And as that happens, growth begins to accelerate. People come into therapy because they're in pain generally. And that pain indicates that they are stuck, that their self has run into obstacles, and it's no longer moving forward. It's stuck. And so the purpose of psychotherapy is to really restore the natural growth of the self, the natural movement and unfolding of the self, so that the person's capacities and abilities can come forward more and more. Now, that's where I've spent much of my life working, researching, and doing clinical work. But in the past, 5, 8 years, I've become more and more interested in how this is also reflected in the brain structure. That when we bring an integral yoga lens to the brain, it's very illuminating. Because it turns out that in neuroscience, our understanding of neuroscience has really transformed in the past decade and a half, 2 decades, with greater capacities for neuroimaging and for understanding on a microscopic level what really happens in the brain. And one of the most powerful things that this has brought forward is how the brain is always growing and moving, right? We think of the brain as a computer, but it's not. A computer is a dead silicon set of chips, but the brain is closer to this living organism that is moving all the time. Every new experience changes the brain. And the brain, it turns out, grows in 2 different ways, called neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So neuroplasticity we've known about for a few decades now, probably 40, 50 years we've known about. Neuroplasticity, also called synaptogenesis, is the brain making new connections among itself. New experience does this. When the brain needs to heal itself after trauma or traumatic shock or brain injury, this process of synaptogenesis, of neuroplasticity, the brain makes new connections. And also, new experience makes new connections happen. And then about 20 years ago, it was discovered that actually the brain also makes new brain cells. It was previously believed that it stopped growing in our early 20s. And then it was discovered that actually through the entire lifespan until the day we die, we are also growing new brain cells. At first, that wasn't clear what the implications of that were, but then it became clear that actually our rate, our neurogenic rate, that is the rate at which the brain makes new connections and grows new brain cells, has a powerful effect on our quality of life. So the original experiments were done on mice, where they increased the neurogenic rate of mice by 5 times. And these mice had powerful cognitive enhancement, right? They learned faster, they figured things out faster, they were more creative, and they were also protected against anxiety, stress, and depression. Scientists have gotten very good actually making mice be anxious or stressed or depressed. And since they have the same brain structures as we do, a lot of this information starts there and then gets carried over to humans. So it turns out that together, our rate of making new neurons and our rate of making new connections among our neurons is the major determiner of how we feel. In depression, there is a major slowdown in neurogenesis and in synaptogenesis. In anxiety, there is a major slowdown of these processes. In stress, there is a slowdown of these things. And it turns out that when these things are optimal, that is, when our neurogenic rate is functioning at its highest capacity, we get peak brain performance, right? We get mental clarity. We get the capacity to learn things very, very quickly. And we get this vital feeling of well-being. It feels good to be alive. It feels great to be on Earth. We can hardly wait to get out of bed and meet the day's challenges. And there is robust emotional resilience in this. Resilience means the capacity to bounce back. And life, of course, is always going to knock us over, but our capacity to bounce back is really important. So with this kind of robust emotional resilience and protection against anxiety and depression, then we can do our sadhana much more easily. Because what are the major obstacles to sadhana? The major obstacles to sadhana usually come from our surface mind, from things we are anxious about, for things that we are ruminating over. Old angers, unresolved resentments, jealousy, shame, embarrassment, interpersonal difficulties, interpersonal stresses, depression. So the brain isn't the cause of consciousness, as the materialistic paradigm would have us believe, but the brain is like a receiver. So this is the metaphor that's used, I think, in a lot of spiritual understandings of the brain, that the brain is kind of like a TV set, right? It's like the signal that comes from, the cable station far away or over the airwaves. But if the TV is broken, we're not going to get a very good signal, right? We want the TV to be operating really well so that it can get the clearest possible signal. It's the same with our consciousness and our brain. We want our brain to be operating at the highest level so that we can receive this consciousness, our inner consciousness, as clearly as possible and do sadhana as clearly as possible. So as I've gotten into this more and more, it's become clear that there are so many neurotoxins in our environment that there has been this kind of general neurogenic slowing, that the brain has become more and more sluggish, and that almost nobody escapes this. So these neurotoxins operate on many different levels. There are physical levels of neurotoxins, like, for example, inflammation. Inflammation, most everybody has elevated inflammatory markers. Inflammation, we need a certain amount of inflammatory possibility, right? Inflammation temporarily gets rid of a cold or helps cure a wound. But the problem is chronic inflammation, when that doesn't turn off. Chronic inflammatory processes eat up, chew up the inside of our blood vessels. And the same with the brain. The neurogenic rate slows way down in inflammation. There are neurotoxins that are physical. And last time I went into some of these, such as smog. 90% of the world's population lives in smoggy air. The 2.5 micron molecules, or particles that are in smog, enter the bloodstream through the lungs and cross the blood-brain barrier and act like little wrecking balls with the very delicate neurons in there. It also creates inflammation and oxidation. And some people believe that up to 30% of Alzheimer's is actually due to smog. In Mexico City, they have found amyloid plaque in 1-year-old babies. So amyloid plaque is what's involved with Alzheimer's, where there's massive amyloid plaque happening. They didn't think that babies 1-year-old could develop amyloid, but in very heavily polluted areas, that begins to happen. Pesticides, glyphosate, which is in Roundup, the most heavily used pesticide in the world, 300 million pounds of it in the United States, heavily used in India now, heavily used in China, in Brazil. In the Midwest and in certain parts of the South, it's so heavily used that it's in the dust, it's in the rainwater. What this does, besides being an antibiotic and wiping out our microbiome, which is disastrous both for our immune system as well as our brain, it also opens up the tight junctions of the intestines, which lets in foreign particles, right? The tight junctions keep out the bad stuff and let in the good stuff. When those tight junctions open up and bad stuff starts flowing in, we get a lot of inflammation. And those tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier also open up. And so we get neurotoxins coming into the brain, creating inflammation in the brain. So we go from leaky gut to leaky brain. A couple of years ago, UCSF did a study and found 93% of Americans have measurable levels of glyphosate in their system. So again, when this happens, the neurogenic rate slows way down, right? Our neurogenic rate is the most important biomarker for brain health that almost nobody has heard of. And so the number of neurotoxins in the environment is huge at this point, over 6,000 that we've never had before. There are also emotional neurotoxins, stressful relationships, angry relationships, having a bully for a boss. It turns out that stressful relationships produce glucocorticoids, and glucocorticoids directly impact the hippocampus, actually are neurotoxic, actually can kill brain cells in the hippocampus. So let me talk just a little bit about the importance of the hippocampus. So, you know, we have these three brains, our reptilian brainstem, our limbic system, which mammals have, which allows us to have emotions, and our cortex, where we do our thinking. Now, the hippocampus has a very interesting role in all these three levels of who we are. The hippocampus is this crescent moon shaped structure, and there's two of them on each side of the brain. Part of that crescent moon is involved in processing new memories. The hippocampus doesn't store memories, it processes new memories. It's what allows new memories to form. In Alzheimer's massively attacks the hippocampus. And so in Alzheimer's patients, we see that the memory just begins to leave. They stop being able to make new memories. They stop being able to retrieve memories. If you know somebody who has Alzheimer's and you've been around them, you see how that when memory goes, the whole self begins to go, right? Somebody who has Alzheimer's is like they're not fully there. It's like they're gone in some way. Memory underpins the sense of self. And it's also responsible, it's involved in many of the executive functions that we do daily. So when memory begins to go, we lose executive function, which is the capacity to really organize our lives. And the whole, it's like the bottom, the rug gets pulled out from the sense of self. So the hippocampus, on the one hand, is involved with cognition. The other part of the crescent moon is involved in emotion regulation, particularly the regulation of anxiety and depression. So when the hippocampus is the one part of the brain that new brain cells form in. Neurogenesis happens mostly in the hippocampus. It also happens in the olfactory bulb, but that's less important. It's the hippocampus, which is really the canary in the coal mine for the brain. When the hippocampus begins to falter, all the other systems begin to falter. So in stress, emotional stress or physical stress, we get this neurogenic slowing. Another thing that slows neurogenesis and neuroplasticity is high blood sugar. 80% of the population in America has high blood sugar, has some kind of insulin resistance. And it's very clear that the higher your blood sugar, the more rapid the rate of cognitive decline. There are also mental and even spiritual ways in which there is a neurogenic slowing. And we don't really have time to go into those because I want to go into some of the good news in all of this, because there's a lot of bad news. The brain is really under assault these days. They're in a way that it never really has been before. And my own sense is that this neurogenic slowing is pretty much of an epidemic, right? Rates of anxiety and depression have skyrocketed in the past 50 years. And it particularly attacks children. Childhood rates of anxiety are up 8 times what they were in the 1960s. Childhood rates of depression are up 5 to 8 times what they were in the 1960s. Not due to better testing, using the exact same standardized tests that were used back then. And with the pandemic, that is shot through the roof. Rates of depression and anxiety are up 4 times what they were before that. And what conventional psychiatry does is basically provide medication that basically suppresses the symptoms. And what my work has been about has been really trying to heal the brain, to kind of restore the brain's growth. That in the same way that the psychic being is always growing, in the same way that the self needs to grow, the brain needs to grow. The brain is this moving, living organism. And when its growth rate is high, everything else lines up. When it becomes sluggish, when it becomes dull, then we get this interference. We get anxiety, we get depression, we get cognitive decline. Rates of Alzheimer's are 5 times what they were in the 60s. There is this neurotoxic minefield in the environment right now. So my own sense is that we need an integral approach to brain health, which in this most recent book I've called holistic, since that's a much more understood word. So holistic healing of the brain means working on all four levels, body, heart, mind, spirit, to restore the natural growth of the brain. So working physically at the level of diet. So the standard American diet, which is abbreviated SAD, is indeed a pretty sorry thing, a pretty sad thing. The standard American diet, which is high carbohydrate, bad fats, low fiber, high processed foods, is a recipe for inflammation, for diabetes, for obesity, for heart disease, for cancer, as well as these mental disorders like anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. So we want to switch to a brain healthy diet. And I think of the brain healthy diet as composed of four major pillars, which I've been calling neurogenic, low carb, and temporarily ketogenic, if possible, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly. So the main thing is neurogenic. We want to restore and bring to its highest capacity the neurogenic possibility of the brain. We want to be able to hit our neurogenic stride. And so the book goes into about 40 different nutrients that have been shown to increase neurogenesis. One of these, probably the most important one, are omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil. For those of you who are vegetarian, you would get this from an algae form of omega-3s. But the brain is made up of about 60% fat. And of that fat, a third to a half of it is DHA. DHA is one of the 3 omega-3 fatty acids. So when we do fish oil, we are generally doing EPA and DHA, right? There's also ALA, which isn't very important and is the main omega-3 in flaxseed oil, hemp oil, and some of these other vegetable oils. But it doesn't convert to EPA or DHA very readily. In fact, you can't raise your omega-3 levels by just doing those forms of omega-3. You need to do an algae form of omega-3 if you're vegetarian. Or if you're doing fish oil, you want to have a balance between EPA and DHA, because EPA is an anti-inflammatory and brings those inflammatory levels down. And DHA allows you to build new brain cells and build new connections and get this neurogenic rate going. Sandrine Thuray, a neuroscientist at London's King College, increased the neurogenic rate by 40% simply by adding omega-3s to the diet. And both books, the neurogenesis book and the more recent holistic healing book, go into about 40 different nutrients that have quite dramatic effects on increasing our neurogenic rate. We also, if we are insulin resistant in some way, want to switch to a diet that has healthy fats and a lower carbohydrate load, right? If we are insulin resistant, it means we have what's being called carbohydrate intolerance. And so when you have lactose intolerance, you don't eat lactose. Or if you're gluten intolerant, you don't eat gluten. And similarly with carbohydrate intolerance, you need to decrease the amount of carbohydrates you do. We also want to eat an anti-inflammatory diet. The standard American diet is a pro-inflammatory diet. There are herbs, there are supplements, and there are ways of eating that are very, very anti-inflammatory. And we also want to increase microbial diversity in the gut, which has a big impact on our mood. as well as our cognition. There are a number of probiotic formulas, meaning bacterial strains, that when they come into the gut, they have lowered anxiety levels by 50%, they've lowered depression levels by 50%, and they've increased cognition. So our brain health and our gut health are tied together. So there's this physical level. We also want to work emotionally. So it turns out that stressful relationships, for example, create not only stress hormones in the body, but they also change the brain waves of the person. That is, when we are in a calm, relaxed state, or we are in a state of love or gratitude, appreciation, some of these higher, more psychic states, we get brain waves which are very coherent, very rhythmic. When we feel stressed, this is work done by the HeartMath Institute out of Santa Cruz. When we're stressed, our brain waves become incoherent. They become very jagged. They're moving all over the place. And not only do the brain waves become more coherent, but the heart rhythm also becomes more incoherent, more jagged. These jagged, incoherent brain waves are reflected in elevated glucocorticoid levels. And glucocorticoid levels, again, we need a small amount of stress hormones for short-term stress. But short-term stress isn't what most people complain of. Most people complain of long-term stress. So short-term stress is good. We need to be challenged, just like when we lift a weight with a muscle to increase the muscle. Temporary stress breaks down the muscle and it grows back stronger. But if we keep doing that, it simply breaks down the muscle and it goes away. It's the same with stress. Short-term stress or moderate stress is a challenge to us, to the brain. And when we meet that stress, by bringing forth our capacities, by bringing forth our abilities, by unfolding the self more fully, then we become ourself more fully. The self begins to more and more develop, more and more grow. So short-term moderate stress actually increases our neurogenic rate. Too much stress, it slows way down. Too little stress, it also slows way down. So we're looking for this Goldilocks zone where stress is able to match our capacity. And when we find that, then we find a kind of aliveness. The stress becomes aliveness. It becomes excitement in living, where we meet the challenges and we really develop our sadhana by unfolding our svabhava, our authentic self, our authentic nature. And at the same time, we are also growing our brain at the same time. We are moving in harmony with our deeper nature and our surface nature at the same time. So it's really an optimal condition for sadhana. There are also mental approaches to increasing our neurogenic rate. It's not just, there's no silver bullet for the brain. There's no one pill we can take. It's a multidimensional process. We need to work mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, all levels. And mentally, what we're talking about, we're really talking about lifelong learning. When we learn new things, that stimulates our neurogenic rate. When we don't learn, there is measurable cognitive decline. At 2 times in life, there's measurable cognitive decline when people graduate from college or when they retire. Unless you have a job where you use your brain, where you use your mind, or when you retire, when you are using your mind to learn new things. Learning new things, listening to this webinar right now is increasing your neurogenic rate. And we want to do that throughout our entire lifespan. We want to be learning new things, whether that's walking home a new way, going to a foreign country, reading, writing is also good, even if it's just email. Using our mind, watching TV more than 3 hours a day, there's a measurable rate of cognitive decline, even in 18-year-olds, even in young children. There's a slowing of cognitive abilities. So also meditation. There are a couple of meditation practices that seem to have a very robust effect on our neurogenic rate. And the two that I've seen a lot of research are mindfulness practices and heart-opening practices. Last time when I talked about the psychic being, we did this psychic being meditation, this heart-opening practice. That has a powerful effect on our neurogenic rate. Similarly with mindfulness practices, the entire length of the hippocampus begins to light up when we do meditation. There's very few things that light up the entire hippocampus. Most light up one side or the other. But meditation, either mindfulness practices or heart-opening practices, appear to have this robust effect on the entire hippocampus. 8 weeks of 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes at night has a measurable effect on our neurogenic rate and on the growth of the hippocampus. They didn't think that such a powerful effect was even possible. They thought it would take years of meditation, but as little as 8 weeks has that effect. So neuroscience is really, just to sum up, is really backing up and kind of enlarging and expanding our view of integral yoga and the importance of working on every level, right? All of these levels, body, heart, mind, spirit, we experience through the brain. The brain integrates all these levels and makes a coherent experience out of it, an integrated experience of the self and of our experience of the world. And when our brain is operating at optimal capacity with peak brain performance, then we are in a place where there is a kind of excited calmness, a kind of calm alertness, which is the best possible condition for sadhana. So let me just stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Brant. There is one question here. Does learning music help neurogenesis?
It does, it does. So ideally, we want to exercise both sides of the brain, right? We have two hemispheres, the right and the left. The left hemisphere controls the right part of the body and vice versa. Most people are left hemisphere dominant. It's a left hemisphere dominant culture and world. And the left hemisphere is verbal, logical, this, therefore that. The right hemisphere is intuitive, visual spatial, responsible for autobiographical memory and music. And so just learning a musical instrument or playing music does increase our neurogenic rate on the right hemisphere. We ideally want both hemispheres to be living and growing, but music is one powerful way of doing that, yes.
There was some research recently, which I read just on internet about that this division on left and right brain is not totally the case.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
There's something else is going on. Something more complex.
That's right. In some ways, it's too simple to divide them that way, and yet in other ways, it's also very useful to divide them that way. It's like there's specialization, but there's also a way in which everything happens everywhere too. So, but if there's injury to one side of the brain, certain functions will simply be lost.
I also just had a question if I could ask, because you had mentioned, Dr. Cortright, very specifically mindfulness. So I'm curious why you've selected mindfulness amongst other meditation methods other than those that are heart-centered, or if it's simply that this is a well-known method that people are familiar with.
Yeah, so meditation was not really explored by neuroscientists for a long time because they thought not much is happening there. But if you meditate, you realize, well, actually, there's a lot happening there. It's a very dynamic process. And so at a certain point, there began to be more and more neuroscientists who were Buddhists. The Dalai Lama would meet with neuroscientists and they would have discussions about mostly Buddhism, mindfulness, and neuroscience. And so neuroscientists began to explore meditation. And the form of meditation that they explored first, and there are now literally hundreds of studies, probably even more by now, looking at the effects of mindfulness practice on the brain. Most of the studies are mindfulness oriented. And mindfulness comes in two big categories, right? There are concentration practices and there are open awareness practices. Concentration practices are like focusing on the breath, tuning into the very, very subtle sensations of the breath, whether it's in the belly or in the nose or some part of the body, tuning into that more and more. And as we do that, we see how noisy the brain is. After a while, that noise begins to settle down and we tune into the subtleties of those sensations more and more. We come into the now more and more. The brain wakes up. Then there are open awareness practices in which we are simply aware of everything that arises and passes away. We're not focusing on one thing. We're simply tuning into all thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, allowing them to arise and pass away. And a similar process happens where we first see how noisy the mind is, but then the dust begins to settle. The mind wakes up more and more. We come into the present moment more and more. Quiet. There's a kind of silence that happens as the mind more and more wakes up. So those are the two main forms that have been explored so far. And there's a lot of both neural imaging as well as research looking at the effects on emotion and cognition. Yeah.
So basically what you say, may I clarify this, that becoming more and more aware of the processes, inner processes in the mind. So silence actually triggers that or helps that to bring the awareness of a deeper consciousness in us or the witness in us, actually stimulates the development of brain.
Yes, yeah. Isn't that amazing that sadhana, the spiritual practice, is one of the best things we can do for our brain as well?
That's amazing. Yeah. There are more questions here. Now, what can be done to help negative environment factors affecting the brain?
That's a great question. It depends on what these negative factors are. If you live in a really smoggy city, it would be really great to get an air filter to breathe inside so that you're not getting these 2-micron particles and below into your brain. It would be good if you had an environment that was physically clean like that. If we're talking about a job that is really stressful, then we look for ways in which we can reduce stress. One thing is we want to try to at least have periods of non-stress. And so to be able to have, like, for example, exercise, aerobic exercise, yoga, any sort of exercise will create initially more physical stress, but then afterwards there is less. And we get this kind of reset, right? So in chronic stress, we have a kind of sympathetic nervous system overdrive, right? We've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. Sympathetic nervous system is when we're about to be involved in a car crash, right? Just adrenaline, glucocorticoids, they course through the system. The parasympathetic is when afterwards we relax, we digest, we repair the body at that point, we calm down. We want a balance between the two. We live in a sympathetic dominant culture, at least in the West. We want a balance between the two. And so if you are in a very stressful job, then you want to have time off. You want to have downtime. You want to have times where you are not stressed so your nervous system can reset. and those glucocorticoid levels can come down. It's chronic stress, which is the big problem. If we're talking about a stressful relationship or a stressful marriage, for example, that's a real problem. They've looked at, being lonely or being alone is also very stressful. Not being in any relationship is very stressful. Loneliness is a bigger risk factor than smoking for heart disease and for depression. There's a neurogenic slowing that comes when we don't have enough contact. Good relationships, loving, supportive relationships are neurogenic, right? In love, they've actually measured this. In love, we get extra oxytocin, we get a reduction in glucocorticoids, and oxytocin is highly neurogenic. It stimulates new brain cells and new synapses. In the same way that glucocorticoids diminish that, love increases that. So loving relationships is highly neurogenic. If you're in a stressful marriage, so relationships are good, but they need to be good relationships. Stressful relationships are also damaging to the brain. They've looked at marriages, long-term marriages, where there is hostility, where there's a lot of anger, and they find heart disease goes way up, the glucocorticoid levels are way up, people die sooner in those kind of marriages. So we need relationships, but they need to be positive, loving relationships and genuinely loving relationships, not just a marriage in name only. It needs to be a genuinely supportive, loving relationship. So it just depends on what kind of stress we're talking about. We want to reduce that stress, eliminate it if possible, or make it moderate if it's not neurotoxic. But it just depends. Sometimes we're not situated in such a way that we can do that, in which case then we need to find alternative ways of getting emotional gratification. If we're not going to get it at work, we need to get it outside of work. Maybe we need to volunteer somewhere. Maybe we need to teach yoga we can have other identities than simply our work identity, through which we get nourishing, affirming support, which will be helpful for the brain. So it depends on the context, and there's a lot more detail we could go into here.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So love is a major medicine, basically.
It is. Yes. But it needs to be real love. Can't be just sort of a picture of it. That's right. And, it's kind of interesting that neuroscience is sort of validating what spiritual traditions have said for thousands of years, right? That peace is a good thing for us, that love is a good thing for us. I mean, in some ways it seems obvious, but it's interesting that there is a neuroscientific validation of this as well.
Oh, very nice. There are more questions here. Does one with a long-standing mental illness need to do something specific for healing that you did not mention? Is toxic medication absolutely necessary? Are there healthier alternatives?
Yeah, that's a very big question. And it depends on the type of mental illness we're talking about. So depression, for example, the longer a person has been depressed, the greater the cognitive decline and the greater the cortical shrinkage. The brain actually shrinks in depression. And the longer the person has been depressed, the greater the cortical shrinkage. So there's also a neurogenic slowing in that process as well. So antidepressants don't work by increasing a so-called serotonin deficiency in the brain, but by increasing serotonin, that increases the neurogenic rate. And so antidepressants, SSRIs, can be helpful in the short run because they stimulate this neurogenic rate. But over time, it causes the brain to downregulate neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. And so they become increasingly hard to get off of. And they also have side effects. First of all, they don't work for more than 50% of the people. And secondly, those that they do work for, over 50% have loss of libido, loss of sexual interest. And there's a kind of emotional blunting that happens with many people. Again, not everybody. For some people, antidepressants can be life-saving. I've seen the therapy begin when people go on antidepressants, but more often I've seen the therapy end when people go on antidepressants who don't really need them. There's this emotional blunting that happens. So the book is really about how to actually heal the brain naturally, as opposed to using psychiatric medications. Another big thing would be anxiety. Anti-anxiety medication, like benzodiazepines, for example, numb the brain. They are slowing of neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, and they just create this general dulling. Again, sometimes if you're in the middle of a panic attack or something, it can be of big help. But you want to stay, I think they are way overprescribed, and people in general are better off getting off of them as soon as possible. But again, we need this neurogenic increase in order for that to happen.
Mhm. There is another question. Being out in nature, working in the garden, being with my dog and cat, and working with animals brings me great joy and a sense of well-being. Does this also promote neurogenesis?
It does, and there's some very interesting research around that. It turns out that being in nature stimulates both neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. The very complex visual stimulation you get from nature, as well as the smells, it increases the parasympathetic nervous system, and it is highly neurogenic. Even having some plants in the house is helpful for a neurogenic increase. But particularly being in nature, gardening, fantastic. Being in nature is highly neurogenic. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
A walk in the park, if you live in the city, will do wonders for you. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think too, Vladimir, I know there's still a couple questions, but I've seen Karen G turn off her mic a couple times, turn it on. I think she's got a question too she'd like to ask.
Sure, please, Karen.
Thank you, Radhiji. Actually, I want to ask that I see the world is in rapid growth of, mind evolution. But so with that emotional pattern has been gone down. What exactly you suggest that, what this brain cell can help us in, developing that?
In developing the emotional?
Right.
Yeah, good. That's right. It almost seems as if evolution, in order to bring forward the capacities of the mind, had to kind of push down the emotional piece, right? We get this wounding, we get this unconscious defensive nature that just sort of pushes down, suppresses, represses, disowns major portions of our emotional life. And my own view is that evolution is moving towards a development of mind that also integrates the emotions, where we can have a fully alive mind, heart, and body. And so Sri Aurobindo and the mother in the school and in the yoga focused a lot on art as a way to enhance and develop the emotional being. And my own feeling is that these days we also have Western psychology, which makes a study of the vital being. That's really what it's about. Looking at ways in which our vital being has become wounded, shrunken, shriveled, contracted, and how to once again release it so it can come into its fullness. That's really what it's about. It's not just about taking care of mental illness, which severe mental illness, it doesn't really know much what to do other than suppress symptoms. But in terms of the sort of the normal neurotic of everyday life, thee and me. That's where psychology, I think, has the most to offer about really getting into these early wounds and these interpersonal patterns that create pain in our lives, that create discomfort, that create stress, where we're with people who, because of our early attachment patterns, we keep repeating them. We keep picking the same wrong partners. We keep being in relationships that are toxic. Being able to really have a kind of emotional freedom and a relational freedom that we don't have when we just stay stuck in those early patterns. So I think of psychology as having a lot to offer integral yoga in this regard, in sort of freeing up our vital being, our emotional being. And as that happens, that also becomes neurogenic, right? Because these wounds, these contractions also operate as a level of stress in the system, right? What keeps our defenses going is an unconscious level of anxiety or stress. And our defenses run on fear and anxiety, most of it unconscious. And so it's like a chronic level of stress in the body. As that changes and as that lifts, there's a calmness which comes in, which is good for the brain, as well as frees up this whole emotional and relational dimension of our lives.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is another difficult question for me too, maybe, regarding glucocorticoids.
Glucocorticoids, yes.
Glucocorticoids. What is the effect and meaning of the corticosteroids, synthetic, as medicine in terms of the brain health and neuroscience? There's some medicine which I have no idea about.
Like taking cortisone shots.
Yes,
Yeah.
corticosteroids. Corticosteroids, yes.
Yeah, corticosteroid. Yeah, they're used generally to reduce inflammation. And over the short run, they do have that effect. They reduce inflammation. But when they are chronic in the system, they have the opposite effect. They increase inflammation. So when glucocorticoids come into the body, into the brain, they can actually make a person a little bit nuts, a little bit crazy. They can have a very disruptive effect on the brain. Some people don't experience that, but many people find that emotionally they become very volatile. They don't feel very good, and they can even get a little bit crazy at times. So it's with caution that those are used in medicine. They're used just rarely and only if needed, because they can have profound psychological effects.
One should not become addicted to any kind of medicine, because then it becomes an artificial support. Most probably it's true for any medicine in that way. Yes. So there's another one. Are there any recent reviews on mushrooms, microdose with the brain health?
Yes. So there has been a whole lot of research, more that's sort of coming into the mainstream now, around using different psychedelics with mental health problems, with depression, with PTSD, with end-of-life anxiety. Mushrooms are the only treatment known for end-of-life anxiety. And there have been now some studies looking at the effects on our neurogenic rate. And it turns out that magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, do stimulate neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So yes, these compounds, the psychedelics that have been investigated so far, appear to be neurogenic. Yes.
There is one the same question which was there about the nature. Person asks, and what about pets? You didn't comment on pets and relations with animals.
Okay.
Working with animals.
Well, there's been a lot of work done with touch, and it seems like touch is also very neurogenic, but it depends on the type of touch. So if it's unwanted touch, that's not going to be neurogenic. That's going to be stressful. That's going to lower neurogenesis. But if it's wanted touch, whether it's touch with a human or whether you're petting a dog or cuddling with your cat, that, first of all, it has this kind of soothing effect on our nervous system. It's very good for the parasympathetic nervous system. And it also stimulates oxytocin, and it is good for the brain. Lack of touch is a problem. You know Jane Goodall's work with chimpanzees? And if you've seen those films where they're always grooming each other and touching each other on top of each other, you know, at some level, we're all just primates, right? And we all need lots of touching. And so pets are a great way to do that. Having a friend put a reassuring hand on our shoulder does wonders for our nervous system when we're upset.
Interesting, very interesting.
Right.
Hugs, yeah, with this feeling, yeah, with the touch. I notice also that animals come to you when you are stressed. For example, if you have a cat and you have a pain somewhere in the stomach, the cat will come and lie down on the stomach. What is this? They feel that you need a help or care or something?
That's a good question. I assume so, right? In animals, the psychic is much closer to the front, right? There isn't this developed mind in which it goes way to the back. It's much closer to the surface. So there is this kind of empathic connection, this kind of tuning in, particularly with mammals, right? You don't get that from a lizard or a snake, right? They don't have a limbic system, so they don't have that empathy. They don't have that emotional. But mammals, those that have the limbic system, there does seem, and where the psychic then is closer to the surface, there is this connection, this greater sense of tuning in to the other person. Yeah.
There is one more question, which is how the kind of functions of the brain relate to psychic being.
I didn't get that. Say it again.
How the functions of our brain relate to psychic being. Psychic being relates to the brain. Is there some kind of course, I do not know how to even address this.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure either. I guess I think of it as if the brain is operating at peak capacity, as clearly, as smoothly, as coherently as possible, then there is the least obstruction to the psychic's influence and to the psychic direction and guidance. So when the brain is not operating well, we get all this static, we get all this interference. And that prevents us from tuning into the deeper psychic aspiration and guidance. So I think of it that way. Now, as the psychic transformation takes place, right, as the body becomes more psychicized because the psychic is connected to the body, how that works with the brain is a very interesting area of research for future integral yoga neuroscientists to look at. It's a fascinating area to think about.
Yeah. What kind of changes brain will undergo when the psychic is awakened in the front?
Very interesting to see. Yes.
Right. I have also one question from myself. That's about, can there be any pill, a happiness pill that you get some kind of chemical or some substance into yourself and brain becomes happy and you get all the bliss of the spirit? And is there a way, because some people think about it in those terms, yes, how to get that pill, that allopathic medicine which would solve all the problems?
Yeah.
Is there a possibility of such kind at all?
I can't imagine that there is, right? The development of consciousness means that we have to become conscious on all of these deep, deep levels. We have to develop our being to come to the state of maturity, right? What you're talking about, is there a pill for enlightenment, or is there a pill for the psychic to fully come forward? I can't imagine that there ever would be. there may be temporary experiences of opening to these deeper places, right? The psychedelics may have a kind of window into that, but they certainly aren't a path into it. They aren't an easy way to get there. And if anything, they can even become a kind of trap where you think, okay, I need this to get there, rather than opening to it through sadhana. I think it always just comes down to daily practice. You know, that, I mean, there is no substitute for daily practice here.
There is no shortcut.
That's right. That's right. And Sri Aurobindo reminds us of that over and over again. I think that's one of the beauties of integral yoga, that it's a many-sided development of our being, and it can accelerate, but there aren't shortcuts in it. Yes. Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful webinar and your answers and your presentation on the brain and relation of the brain to our spiritual being and consciousness. I hope we will come back together again, and we'll discuss more topics on consciousness and the development of brain and our health. Thank you, Brant, very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I'm just going to remind everybody very quickly, we'll be sending out an email later today or tomorrow. Next Saturday, we have Dr. Sumitra Basu returning for part 2 on the overmental and supramental consciousness. So you should be receiving an email and Zoom registration link shortly. And I too would just like to thank you so very much, Dr. Cortright, for your illuminating talk. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.